Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture on the principles of design. The good news is that this lecture is pretty short and it rounds out our kind of introductory first weeks where we looked at some basic kind of ideas about what artists are, how to interpret works of art, some of the key terminology. We've worked our way slowly through many of the formal elements of art and their effects. So this is all kind of setting the groundwork for the remainder of the quarter, and today we round that out by talking about the principles of design, or frankly even more specifically, what we're talking about primarily is what art historians and critics call composition. And composition is basically the way that objects or shapes or colors and so forth are arranged in a in a work of art, whether it be a sculpture or a painting or, illuminated manuscript. It could be anything. The way that those things are arranged and the types of effects that those arrangements have on us and the way that they can emphasize certain things, de-emphasize other things, and so forth. Now again, we're just setting the groundwork for this class, and so after we get done with kind of talking about these general principles of art and getting the key terminology out there, starting next week, we'll begin a long series of lectures that cover the history of art, or some of the history of art, and we'll put these to use. And we'll be thinking even more specifically about how these works of art meant or functioned or were understood in their very particular cultural context, the way that people thought of these things, right? So I said there's good news in that this lecture is fairly brief. The bad news is, of course, this week you also have a quiz, and I will just remind you to read the prompt for the quiz very carefully and be very thorough when you answer those answers. Nothing should be a surprise. We've gone over all of these things in the textbook and in the lecture. The quiz is really just to make sure that the major ideas have been absorbed by you and that you don't have any questions or are running into any major stumbling blocks. I honestly think anyone who puts any work into this at all should get a very good grade. I'd be surprised if anyone got below a B, unless you really just didn't do any of the work, but it should be pretty simple. I shouldn't say that, right? Not simple, but, put in the work, get it done, make sure that we can check in to make sure you've got all the major ideas under your belt, and I think if you put that work in, you'll do fine. Okay, so then on with today's lecture. Again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think the text in this case does a really good job explaining these ideas, but I've picked some of the ideas that I think might lead to a little bit of, wondering about what the text is saying, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these things. Our first work then is this work by Leonardo da Vinci called The Vitruvian Man, and it's used by your textbook to talk about a couple of major ideas. The big one that your text wants to talk about is unity. Now, unity is a tricky idea, frankly, in the history of art and in visual language. But what it basically means for artists is that everything that is in a work of art is unified around either a major kind of design idea or a major aesthetic idea. And I usually like to explain the idea of unity before we look at the visuals by saying, if you had a really good writing instructor and you were asked to write an essay that had a thesis that you were trying to prove, the thesis is the unifying idea, and everything in that writing, of course, should be supporting that thesis. And that's the same idea when we're talking about unity in visual language. In a very kind of metaphorical sense, the thing that unifies this work of art is the belief that in the world, in the universe, there's a kind of order that exists. And so what Leonardo da Vinci was doing here is that he was giving form to an idea that actually was first written about by Vitruvius. Now, Vitruvius was a Roman, and he was an architect for Julius Caesar, among other things. And he explained in one of his books, called The 10 Books on Architecture, that to create the perfect human form, that perfect human form would fit perfectly inside two other perfect shapes, the square and the circle, such that, and you see it here, that if that figure put out his arms to his side, up high, those arms and his feet would fit perfectly within a circle, and if he dropped them down lower, those arms and feet would fit perfectly inside a square. So it's a perfect kind of ordering principle. Now, the middle of this entire figure is his navel, kind of the, the thing that connects us to our mothers in utero, and is kind of the center of the human being. So that if you put, let's say, a drawing compass that sharpened in the navel and drew around the outside of the figure, you would perfectly be circumscribed within this form. In other words, what he's trying to say is everything is unified by this perfection. The perfect human being is composed in such a way as to create this perfect perfection. Now, I'm going to add on to this a little bit, something that's not really clarified in your textbook, which is this figure is what we call a perfect human being that's made up of a module system. And that module system, which I'll come back to a little bit later on again to show you another example, is what we call a canon of proportions. It's a set of ideal proportions that are basically mathematical, that one would use to create perfect human forms, even perfect architecture. And it's used by many cultures, but the Greeks were the ones who used it in kind of the most advanced way early on, and then it was picked up by the Romans, and of course Leonardo da Vinci, who was an Italian Renaissance artist, who's very interested in ancient Roman and Greek ideas, picks it up again here. So what I mean by a canon of proportions is that what an artist will do is find out a perfect set of mathematical ratios based upon, again, geometry and mathematical equations. A simple way to put it is a standard canon of proportions will use one length of a digit of a finger. So this finger, the length of this digit to the entire finger is a little bit over 3 to 1. And then they'll use that proportionality of 3.12, whatever it is, and use it to compose the perfect hand, so that the perfect hand is a certain length, and there are 3.12 of those hands to an arm, and the same of feet to legs, and so forth. You'll hear about this in architecture in a little bit when we talk about Greek architecture. Same thing happens with the proportionality of the body. For old Greek artists and Renaissance artists and Roman artists, the perfect height of a human body was exactly 7 heads high. So again, when you use this module or this ratio system to compose a perfect unified form, we call it a canon of proportions. And of course, just to kind of remember what we were talking about last week, this is, on the one hand, you would want to say it's a naturalistic human being, but it's a perfect human being, so we call it idealistic. Yeah? So, another thing about unity is that unity takes place within a certain kind of compositional system. And one of the big ways we talk about how both figures are composed and frankly entire paintings or sculptures are composed is by thinking about if we split them right down the middle, right in half, so down what we call their axis, what would the right side look like versus the left side? And when they look basically like mirror images of one another, we call that symmetrical, right? Symmetrical. Now it can be perfect symmetry, meaning each side is exactly the same. It can be what we call bilateral symmetry, which means on each side things are pretty much exactly the same. Or it can be asymmetrical, right? One side's totally different than the other side. It can also be what we call balanced, and we'll look at some other examples of this in works of art, where a work might not be symmetrical, meaning each side isn't exactly the same or even close to the same, but there's equal visual weight on each side. In other words, there's a bunch of stuff going on the right and a bunch of stuff going on the left. Now, when an artist relates these two sides together in such a way as to make a correspondence, we call it unified. Some works of art go out of their way to not be unified. Unified works of art makes us believe that there's one central meaning or one kind of message that is being said. If a work of art is not unified, you're to think, just like in our everyday world, there might be a lot of different things going on, and they're all little compartmentalized meanings or messages. Yeah, so that's one set of ideas. So then, let's look at another example of this. Oh, we're frozen up again, like usual. Give me a minute here. This never happens during the week until I, of course, tape your lectures. It must not like Panopto very much. And we'll try opening this back up again. Okay, so hopefully that solved our problem. So let's look at another example of something that is not symmetrical at all, but is in various ways kind of unified, brought together. And that's this a great example. This is a Frank, Gehry, and Vlado Melinek building known as the Racine Building, or frankly, better known as Fred and Ginger, for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. These famous old school dancers, because it looks like kind of dancers. Now, obviously, if you were to split this down the middle, and you follow my cursor here, by middle I mean this facade, the face of the building down here, the left side and the right side don't look similar. One is full of glass, the other is, masonry. One has little compartmentalized windows, the other feels like the entire facade is windows. One is fairly cylindrical and the other has this big bend in it. And yet, there's a certain kind of equal visual weight on each side, isn't it? Off on the right, it's a little bit more squat and a little bit rounder, but off on the left, it's taller and it spreads out into our space, so it feels roughly like the same weight. And then you have this, so we've got an asymmetrical balancing, in other words, right? Not totally disparate. Now we've got the more complex thing, which is it's unified. It feels like these two are drawn together. And one of the ways that this is done is that this form off to the left bends into the form on the right, and you see these lines that are running across the glass here. This is all metal work, by the way, that continue onto the masonry part over here and bond them together, almost like a dress is flowing over the other figure here. So you can have things that are asymmetrical and still be balanced, is what I'm saying. Or you can have things that are asymmetrical and still be unified so that they feel like they go together. Now, unity and balance, these are things that are, they're like harmonies. They draw things together. They make them feel like they are bound together in some way. So then, perfect symmetry is like this. It's something that is, everyone knows what this is. This is the Taj Mahal. I didn't even put it on your lecture guide because it's so famous here. It's symmetrical from every single side. Every facade looks exactly the same. It was created as a mausoleum to this mogul's 14th wife, I think it was, his favorite though. Wife, and it's this beautiful, beautiful, building. Now, perfect symmetry means, in this case on architecture, all facades are the same, that on the right and the left-hand side of the axis, you have exactly the same types of shapes and types of design. And the thing about perfect symmetry is once you see one side, you know what the whole building is. So perfect symmetry is about the most unified form you can get, and unification lends itself to rationalization. And by that I mean you can think this building into existence. You don't need to travel around all sides. Once you see one side, you know what they all look like. So it's really predictable, it's really ordered, it's really understandable. Now, symmetry can also be used to obviously make a point. It's part of the visual language of arts, and in this case, in this work by the Mexican artist associated with surrealism, Frida Kahlo, a work called The Two Fridas, we see her creating something that is, let's say, it's bilateral symmetry, both in each of the human forms, but also in the fact that both of these are clearly self-portraits of Frida Kahlo. The only difference is what they're wearing, right? And what they're holding, and what you see of their internal organs here. Now, she's creating this symmetry in two versions of herself because she believed that her husband of the time, a famous artist, Diego Rivera, only loved one half of her. And the part that he loved was the part that you see on the right-hand side. Frida in her traditional Mexican Tehuana outfit. This is the woman that he thought of as being very closely associated with the traditions of Mexico. Of course, Diego Rivera, if you don't know, was a socialist who really wanted his art to change the plight of the lower classes, and he associated Frida with those lower classes, even though Frida Kahlo grew up in a very middle-class family, and a big part of her life was that middle-class, very well-tutored, very well-dressed, and frankly, fairly affluent side to her, which we see over here on the left. Now, the point that she wants to make is the figure on the right, if you're to get in close on her, is holding in her hand a little cameo of Diego Rivera. And and you see her heart up there is healthy and happy, and the vein twists around, goes all the way down to Diego Rivera, and then goes through her heart and goes over to her other alter ego, her more kind of Western side. And then you see her heart looks kind of damaged and diseased, and there's an extra artery that comes around and is being clipped off in her hand, but it's not stopping the blood there. This is her way of commenting on how, part of her is heartbroken, part of her who is, part of herself, this more affluent side, is not being loved by her husband, who, by the way, is cheating on her all the time. And it's her way to make a commentary on the way that she feels torn between two kinds of, or two parts of herself. Symmetry can be, and balance can be incredibly complicated, such as this work here. This is a work that we are going to encounter later on in the quarter when we're looking at the Baroque period. So I'm not going to tell you all of the meaning of this work, but it's a work it's by Johann Vermeer, called Woman Holding a Balance. And it's a work that is about trying to balance both the things that you want materially in life, like wealth and a nice home and cool clothes, and your spiritual needs as well, because this is a very, very Christian time. And so she holds in her hand this balance because she's trying to balance those things, the want for material goods, but also paying attention to your spiritual salvation. Now, the work itself is just a big balancing act. It starts with the scales in the center, right? And what are they trying to balance? Well, here's the material stuff, gold and jewels and jewelry and so forth, and coins on the table. But up above that, balancing it, if you split it now in half, both right down the middle and right down the middle again crosswise, off to the top left-hand side is light and a bare wall, right? Nothing there, austerity. And the light was seen as a symbol of God. So this is religion and this is austerity. And then down below it, balancing that out, is material wealth, right? So it's being balanced here up and down through the side. Now, if you cut it down this way vertically, you see as well up above her a symbol of religion. It is a last judgment scene versus her living in her material realm, right? So it's balancing these things in the picture. through a series of asymmetries, right? On the left-hand side, up high, not much going on. On the right-hand side, up high, a lot going on, right? These are balanced out, though, because one represents spirituality and the other materiality. It's even so interesting, when you get up close on this, this is how far this artist went, so follow with me. I'm just going to get us in close. If you can see this up here, this is a nail that's been nailed into the wall, and next to it is a hole where one presumes another nail was nailed. And anyone who ever has hung a picture before knows what this means, right? The artist is trying to balance this picture. Originally, they had nailed the nail in here, put the picture there, it didn't work. Obviously, there was an earlier time it didn't work there either. Balancing is, he wants to say, through trial and error. And there's a close-up on that balance itself, right? So everything in this work, and we'll get to this later on in the quarter, is about balancing of asymmetries, balancing of the material and the spiritual. You can even go so far as to think of things that are completely abstract as being a balancing of visual weights. Now, there's a really great diagram in the chapter in your text that shows you about visual weights. Balance can take place even if things are totally asymmetrical, as they are here in this work by Pierre Mondrian called Composition with Red, Blue, and Yellow. And what I mean by that is the more you look at this, the more you'll realize that that huge visual field of red is kind of balanced out by these areas around it of white, white, blue, white, white, and yellow. It's almost the same size, as a matter of fact, right? The other thing that's being balanced out here are planes against the building blocks of line. Matter of fact, these lines, the vertical lines, big long one here, very narrow, versus another narrow one down here, balancing it, and a thicker one here. The artist is playing around with balancing of form in a really complex way, right? It's a very dynamic type of form. It's in movement. It's not a simple, perfect symmetry, but the artist is like doing the most nuanced things they can do to balance this form. That balancing even goes so far as in some of these planes, the brush strokes go vertically, and in others, they go horizontally. On some of the lines, the brush strokes go vertically and others go horizontally, balancing everything out, which, by the way, Mondrian thought was the kind of the essence of life, was a perfect kind of balancing of all forms. Again, this is a work that we'll meet later on in the quarter. It's a work by Diego Velázquez, known as Las Meninas, or the Maid Servants. It's a really interesting balance and incredibly complex picture, but the main thing I want to talk about here, because you will learn about this in much more detail later on, is that the painting is set up as a really interesting play of space. Remember we were talking about space last time. You know, the way that an artist tricks you into believing that what you're looking at is a very illusionistic space. Well, in this one, what we see actually is, follow my cursor again. Right here is Diego Velázquez, the artist, and he is hard at work painting a canvas over here, and he seems to be peeking his head out to look at us in this space, like he's painting our portrait. So in other words, he's engendering, or basically creating the space in which we exist. And we can imagine that that space is over here. So in other words, there's a kind of symmetry going on in this work in which the picture plane, that thing that divides us from the space, is the balance. And everything in our space becomes one half of the equation, and his space becomes the other half of the equation. Now the funny thing is, what's actually in our space, if you look at this back little area on the wall, that is a mirror, and that mirror shows you a reflection of the king and queen who have come to visit him while he paints a portrait of their daughter, who is down here. Kind of interesting, right? And this is, again, a kind of, I don't know if I want to call it exactly balance, but it's like balancing. It's generating our space and making us think about where we are when we view this picture. Now, simple, again, we've talked about symmetry, most, perfect symmetry, bilateral symmetry, balancing of weight on both sides. And of course there is this type of symmetry too, which is called radial symmetry. And radial symmetry is just, you know, things that radiate from a central point so that everything along this kind of, if you cut this into a pie shape, would be symmetrical. This is an example, of course, of one of the rose windows, those giant windows in Chartres Cathedral. These are, you know, anywhere from 45 to 65 feet across. Huge, beautiful stained glass windows. Again, when you have balance and symmetry, in this case radial symmetry, it creates a kind of pleasing repetition of shape. You see a correspondence of shapes here that would make you know that, for instance, when you look at the center point, that's the most important figure, that's Jesus in here, and then the figures radiating around him, you're probably going to know that in each one of these little circles are a figure that are the same. These are the apostles. And then you move out into this realm and you'll know that all these things are pretty much the same. What do they represent, and so forth. In other words, it creates visual correspondences in a picture so as to organize the subject so that you can understand why it's organized the way that it is. And the more complex, you know, that organization, the longer you're going to spend looking at it. The simpler it is, the quicker you can take it in. So then, let's put these all together and then let's move on to another idea. So if we look at this work again, I think we've looked at this before. This is Jacques-Louis David's famous The Oath of the Horatii, or The Oath of the Sons of Horus. It's a painting again in which these three men off to the left-hand side are pledging their allegiance to the French state, to the Roman state, to go off and fight against their neighbors, the Albans, and try to win. And again, this is three greatest warriors on each side fighting against each other, and winner take all. So they're sacrificing themselves for the better of the state, right? Now, when we look at this, if you split this down the middle, straight down the middle, you'll notice that it's let's say, not perfectly symmetrical, but it is pretty balanced. More of Horus, who is in the middle, leans back off to the right-hand side with these female figures. But these female figures are smaller. They don't take as much visual space up, right? They're down here low. And they're further away from the picture plane. If you look at this line on the floor, they're pushed further back than either Horus or the men are. The men take up a little bit more space. They're a little bit closer to us, right? So they kind of balance each other out, but not perfectly, do they? Because the artist wants to emphasize one side more than the other. And so these men who take up a little bit more of the visual space are the emphasis. The women who are acting emotionally, like, oh no, someone's going to die, and we'll get to this work later on in the quarter too in much more detail. He wants to de-emphasize them, so as to say these men are acting the way that they're supposed to. They're sacrificing for the state. The women are acting emotionally. You know, that's not the right way to act. Yeah? So it's symmetrical in that way. But it's using that kind of non-perfect symmetry or balancing in order to emphasize the left over the right. So emphasis can be created by creating more visual weight on one side rather than the other. Another way that artists create emphasis is by establishing what is known as a focal point, a focus, right? And the way that they do it here, if you just watch your eye looking at this picture, where does your eye go over and over again? And probably you'll notice it goes right here to where all these swords are gripped in the hand of Horus. One of the reasons it does that is that our eye wants to seek out whatever is in the center of a canvas. It tends to go there, right? Another reason, though, it goes there is all the implied line in this painting. Horus is looking there, the men are looking there, they're basically pointing there to look at that one point. And then finally, the light source shines on and creates the highest highlight there. Yeah? Even going further than this, remember linear one-point perspective? See these lines of the floor, how they all recede back here? They all recede back to almost exactly that point, which is going to lead our eye to that focal point again. Now, why is that the focal point? because that is about unity, right? Every one of these men is unified under a common principle. Let's go fight heroically to save Rome, right? So we have a focal point then, and then we look at the men. They're the second focal point. Then we look over at the women, third emphasis, and so forth. Artists use these elements so as to create an emphasis, a clear focal point, a secondary point of interest, a third point of interest, and move us around the picture and create a kind of hierarchy of what is to be understood as more or less important in this case, a painting. In this case, this work by Georges de la Tour, Joseph the Carpenter, we see a story of Jesus as a boy, and it's really simple. Just see if you can figure out before I say it, what is the focal point here and how is it achieved? And if you're thinking, well, it's the young boy in his face, you're right, because the contrast, the difference between the light of Jesus's face and the rest of the picture is much more than anything else and will draw our eye there. He's most important. Then you see the highlight on Joseph. He's secondary importance. Moving on from this, just quickly, I'm sure everyone gets these ideas, but it's easy enough to get from the textbook, but I just want to re-emphasize them. This is a famous work, very recent, by Kara Walker, who is a black woman artist who has been doing really interesting work now for 15 years that's all about drawing people's attention to the persistence of racism and racial inequities and the history of slavery and prejudicial imagery and so forth that continues to today. Now this work is called A Subtlety. It's got a very long subtitle that goes, A Subtlety, the Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet taste from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant from 2014. It's a huge work, and your book uses this to talk about scale, right? Scale means relative size. If within a picture, all of the figures in the picture are correctly scaled, that means you don't have any gigantic figures and tiny figures. They're all relatively the right size, relative to each other. When an artist manipulates scale, as they do here, to create a huge form, you want to ask yourself, why? This huge form is taking this figure who is clearly, ethnically African-American or Negro, and making her into a sphinx. And then he makes her huge, right? Or she makes her huge, this huge form that makes us tiny. And why would you do that? Well, there's a couple of different explanations. One is to make you think this is a huge problem, these kinds of racial stereotypes. Combining the Negro features with a sphinx was always seen as monstrous and other and scary, is meant to make you think about the way that African Americans or blacks have always been othered by our culture, made into minorities, made to be seen of as monstrous or lower, almost animalistic compared to white culture. Now, of course, coupling this, it's made out of, it's got an armature that's actually, some other kind of composite material, but over the surface of this was sprayed sugar, tons of sugar, so it literally is sugar. She does that so as to draw your attention to how the sugarcane industry is dominated by people of color who have to work for low wages. How sugar, of course, when it is first, cane sugar anyway, when it's first produced, is brown, but needs to be refined so as to make it white. And what we think about in terms of social refinement and how black culture was oftentimes seen as unrefined and how that may contribute to racial inequities, right? So all of that is built in here, and the scale of this makes it something that you, first of all, calls your attention. It just is saying, wow, look at how huge this is, 2 stories high, basically. And the problem is equally as big. Equally, this is a work by Hosu called Public Figures from the late 1990s. In this case, it's meant to be a kind of, a stand that would hold, one would presume, a heroic sculpture to some event. It's called a plinth, right? These stands that hold these sculptures. But in this case, there's no sculpture of one heroic person. Instead, Hosu put 600 little figures of various ethnicities and genders holding that plinth up, so as to say, it's heroic acts are oftentimes achieved by many, many diverse individuals and not just one, person who becomes the figurehead for that act. So he's reduced the scale of these figures to a tiny little size, and what they're holding up is this huge thing. So relatively, if you imagine these human figures being real size, human size, that plinth would be even bigger, and he can make us think about that just by messing around with the scale or the relative size of figures. And then finally we talked about, I've got one more of these. This is Ron Mook's work. Ron Mook is an Australian artist who creates these incredibly realistic figures, but he creates them oftentimes in a huge or tiny scale. So this one's called Big Boy, and you can see the figures off to the side to get a sense of how big he is. He's about, 5 or 6 times human scale, and it just draws your attention, doesn't it? Pretty cool work. Finally, just to wrap this up again, proportionality. So proportionality, which we talked about with the Vitruvian Man, is not the same as scale at all. Proportionality is the relative proportions of components of a work of art. So if we think of this figure by Polykleitos, known as the Doryphoros or spear bearer, which is a Roman copy of an ancient Greek work, this is an example of a canon of proportions. He's perfect proportionality. He's got 3 point whatever fingers to a hand, that many hands to an arm, that many feet to a leg, exactly 7 heads high, perfect, double the thickness to the width, and all of these proportionalities in here. This was meant to, and we'll see this in one of our first weeks when we go into the history of art, this is meant to, again, be the perfect human male form. And it's all built upon a canon of proportions. Now, if you think about proportionality, though, proportionality can be something that makes sense in terms of real humans or mathematical systems, like the Doryphoros, or you look at this work by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang on the right, known as Mademoiselle Riviere, and you look at her, as your book points out, her right arm, the arm that's on our left, and it doesn't look right? It's too long. At least for a real human being, it's too long. But the proportionality for this work of art, in which that arm kind of mimics the shape of the oval of the frame, that creates this nice, long, beautiful curve there, maybe the proportionality here for a human is wrong, but the proportionality for a pleasing artistic form might be appealing to us. And then finally, again, just so you know that proportionality is not just with human figures. Proportionality also is something that is used in architecture in particular, and one of the most famous examples is the Parthenon in Athens. This work that was created roughly the same time period as the Doryphoros and is all about perfect proportions as well. Now you can read about what those proportions are in your textbook, but basically a system by which x equals 2y plus 1, so a kind of mathematical equation, is used in this work of art over and over and over again. So for instance, x equals 2y plus 1, there are 8 columns across the facade of this, across the front, and if you use the equation, the side then will be 17 columns, right? 2 times x plus 1. And the same thing happens with the distance between the steps and the height of these things and everything. So proportionality is built into this architecture. Okay, so this is just meant to be a kind of, end cap to our discussions about the formal elements. Now we've been thinking a little bit about how they're combined. Good luck with your quiz, and next week we'll start on the long kind of hors d'oeuvre tray of all these wonderful moments in the history of art and architecture.